So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this EPC update and post-summit briefing, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, and our special guest this week, delighted to welcome Helena Hahn, who is a policy analyst in the EPC's European Diversity and Migration Programme. As we discuss the outcome of last week's meetings, both of the European political community and the informal summit of EU leaders in Spain. As always, totally interactive session. I have some questions for our panel. If you would like to ask them a question, please either use the Q&A box, and please be as brief as possible. No short essays if you can avoid it, please. If you prefer to speak, please click on the raised hands button and I will unmute you when the time comes. So we have a lot of ground to cover today, so let's dive straight in. And Fabian, perhaps if I could come to you first, and before we discuss the outcome of those meetings I mentioned a moment ago, we have seen momentous developments over the weekend with the Hamas attack on Israel. How has the EU responded so far, and how do you see this playing out?
Well, I think firstly, what is really important to emphasize is the terrible nature of this attack. It is terrorism, pure and simple. And I think what we have seen in the response of the European Union right across the board is that condemnation of what has been happening, and also the reiteration of the right for Israel to defend itself, to defend its people against such terrorist attack. I think clearly this is an ongoing situation. There has been an escalation. We only know some of the things, and I'm sure much more will come out. Clearly, this is destabilizing for the whole region. We have the involvement through Hamas of Iran. So this is a very serious development which has global implications. There are some questions also about the role Russia might have played. I think this is also one to watch, but what it all emphasizes is really what a volatile global situation we're all acting in, and we all have to prepare for crisis after crisis, and find better ways of reacting and possibly anticipating some of these developments.
Thank you. And just staying with you for a moment, another development over the weekend, which impinges on EU politics, the state election results in Germany, where we saw that surge in support for Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD. They came in second place in Hesse, third place in Bavaria, while the coalition government parties all made significant losses. Fabian, just staying with you for a moment, again, how do we read that, and does it have any implications for the European Union?
I think in the immediate analysis, it won't have a big impact on the European Union, but it is part of a much longer term trend and a very significant trend, that we have these populist anti-parties, very often far-right parties, who are becoming successful, and who are also influencing the political agenda through that way. And it has to be said, particularly in Germany, it's a disgrace that a party like that can reach that level of voting, but it is also a reality which will influence European politics, not least in the area of migration, where there is a clear migration dimension, but also in areas such as climate policy, where a lot of climate skepticism is now being fueled by these parties.
Janis, migration, of course, one of the issues that came up, well, wasn't due to come up at the European Political Community meeting, but was due to come up at the informal summit. Can you just give us a sense of what was the focus of the discussions at both summits? And then we'll delve into the migration part with Helena in a bit more detail in a moment.
Sure. Just one addition to Fabian's last point. The results in the elections in Germany was a strong slap in the face of the governing coalition in Berlin, the federal government, because all three parties scored very badly, both in both the Bundesländer. So it was a strong sign, which also has repercussions on the European level. But coming back to the EPOC meeting and also to the informal summit, given that the EPC or EPOC, whatever you want to call it, is a pan-European forum for high-level political exchanges, everything that is on the agenda of a certain significance is being put on the agenda. So it was no surprise that obviously migration was high on the agenda, but also a discussion about Ukraine, about Nagorno-Karabakh, about the tensions between Kosovo and Serbia. And if it would have happened 2 days later, definitely they would have also talked about what is happening in Israel. So it is a forum to discuss all these issues. The question is as to whether it's actually leading to anything. And here one can be somewhat skeptical, but I'm sure we're going to come back to that. And when it comes to the informal summit, what was key on the agenda was the discussion about the future strategic priorities, the strategic agenda, which the European Council is due to submit in June. So it was the beginning of that debate, and it included a number of different issues which were discussed, including, by the way, also migration, where there was, again, no agreement being able to be found among the 27. We're going to come back to that in a second. But they were also discussing other issues which potentially will be put on the agenda. But it was a kickoff for a debate that will take much longer in the upcoming weeks, months.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to some of those other issues. But Helena, the question of migration, first at the EPOC meeting, the European Political Community meeting, Spain had refused to put it on the main agenda. Perhaps you could explain why they didn't want to talk about it, given, as Janis says, it is supposed to be the forum for those high-level exchanges. And then we saw this side meeting called by Rishi Sunak, which came out with some form of a plan. We saw a joint call for action by Rishi Sunak and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. What was going on there behind the scenes? Why did Spain refuse to put it on? Did the Sunak meeting achieve something? Where are we at the end of all that?
Yeah, so I think there's two important factors to consider here. On the one hand, I think there's a broader question, and we might get to that in a short while as well, about what sort of the added value of the EPOC is in general. And so in addition to that, however, we also have the ongoing negotiations around the new Pact on Migration and Asylum happening. And then thirdly, we also know that migration has a tendency of co-opting an agenda. And this is kind of what we saw in this double summit time period of 2 days before the weekend. And so I think the primary motivation was precisely to avoid that this would be further politicized, knowing that, of course, it would likely pop up as a topic of discussion at the informal EUCO. We also have to remember that we have a formal European Council coming up at the end of October. And so whatever is discussed on migration at this informal European Council, or what is not discussed, kind of paves the way for what we might be able to expect at the formal EUCO. And so then to the second part of the question, we have to remember that Sunak already wanted to put migration on the agenda at the first EPOC meeting in June. And we can expect that as a host to a meeting next year, he'll likely try to do as much. But the kind of side diplomacy that we saw in the alliance building, I would actually kind of switch the perspective and move to it and consider what Meloni made of it, because she has been very proactively conducting diplomacy, not just within the EU context, but also with third countries. And what unites the two is not just this sort of wish list or the shopping list of the points that are laid out in the 8-point plan, which I would say still very much driven by domestic interests. What unites them is, in fact, that they are both driving very strict campaigns against small boats or NGO boats. And so the more that they can signal that they're allied, that they have this this new basis for cooperation, the more that this kind of sort of populist agenda against migration gains ground, not least in the public eye.
And is there anything, that 8-point plan, how concrete is it? And does it align with the EU's priorities, the things the EU is focusing on in this area, or does it bring new elements for this wider community?
So we also have to remember that this 8-point plan is, while signed by the European Commission, was, in addition to Italy and the UK, only signed by the Netherlands, France, and Albania. And Albania, of course, plays a very important role because not few of the people who tried to reach the UK in these small boats crossing the channel were in fact of Albanian origin. And so again, there's that domestic consideration of the UK that plays a role as well. Otherwise, like I mentioned, it reads akin to a shopping list of many other action plans that we've also seen originating from the EU. There's a strong focus on anti-smuggling measures. This is also a recurring top priority of the European Union. And so in that sense, it very much aligns. However, there's a question of what is the follow-up going to be. We already know that bilateral tensions between the UK and France exist. Sometimes this has widened to other countries in the region from which people have departed. So it's really a question of, can the sort of Sunak-Meloni alliance go beyond simply establishing that there's a plan and actually following up on some of these points.
So that row between Spain and Rishi Sunak led to the cancelling of the final press conference. Come back on that in a moment. But then at the summit, we saw the passage on migration that should have been included in the Granada Declaration being left out. Charles Michel, the European Council President, issuing his own declaration. Reading that declaration, it's hard to see what caused so much trouble with Poland and Hungary that they blocked its inclusion. Again, can you explain? I mean, Viktor Orban used extraordinary language after the summits because he said there was no chance of a compromise on migration because, and I quote, "we were legally raped." What was he referring to? What was the row all about? Was it just gesture politics, or was there some issue of substance in what was in the declaration?
Well, what his statement referred to was the fact that not just now, last week, when member states finally agreed on a common position on the final missing piece of the new pact on migration, the so-called crisis regulation, but also at the JHA Council in June, member states were able to adopt a common position by qualified majority and not by unanimity. And so what Hungary here specifically referred to is the fact that they felt that they were overrun. The positions that were adopted in both cases don't go far enough for Hungary and Poland, which is why they have continued to voice their opposition to it. And so we also said that Orban said, well, actually, all of these files should be adopted by unanimity. This is the way how it's supposed to be. But we clearly know at this point that migration policy is something where we see compromise and really not one common position that all member states can get on board with.
I want to come back to you in a moment on where we go from here, but Janis, just a comment to the behaviour yet again on this issue from Hungary and Poland. We have vital elections in Poland coming up next week. How do you read this, and what is the discussion at the moment within the EU of how to, if there is a way to solve this issue of Hungary and Poland continually putting a block on key issues like this?
I think that there's the general reading of it, also among the key actors in the discussion, that at the end of the day, it's politics, it's elections, and that it very much depends on what will happen. For example, you already mentioned it, on the 15th of October, what will be the outcome of the elections in Poland. And I'm not saying that this will be the case, but if you would have a change of government, that obviously will change the debate in many ways, because if you have a situation where it's, and Helena is right, doesn't mean that 26 agree on everything. They all have also different opinions. But if you can lead to a compromise which includes the 26 and excludes one of the member states, it's a totally political different situation than if it also involves Poland. So it very much is about the politics of it. Obviously, it is driven by internal concerns and by the profiling of the governments in power, also the heads of government, or of Kaczyński in the case of Poland, who's the key player on the peace side. So it is very much about politics. And unfortunately, and I remember having this debate already some months ago, also in the context of the update, as to whether migration will be high on the political agenda in the months to come ahead of the EP elections. And there were some who had hoped that it could be unpoliticized, that yes, there will be differences, but it would not be top of the agenda, that it will be somewhat below the radar, meaning that compromises can be found. But I think what all this is showing, also what happened last week, but also before that, is that this was wishful thinking. It will remain high on the agenda. It was high on the agenda in Germany over the weekend with respect to the elections. It will be high also on the agenda when it comes to the EP elections. And I say that because some believe that it might not be, that migration might not be high on the agenda, but I would think that it's safe to assume that it will be.
Fabian, what should the EU do about this, if anything?
Well, I think we have to recognize that there are no easy, quick solutions. That this is an issue which is going to continue to be on the agenda, and even if we have a different outcome in Poland, that might temporarily change the situation, but we already have a move within the mainstream parties to become more skeptical, to become more in the direction of controlling migration, rather than having a constructive debate about it. I think what we're also seeing is that there are still fundamental differences between member states on some of the key issues. And that does raise the question of what kind of reforms we will need to make the European Union ready for enlargement. So this is, again, everything is connected with each other, but we have a very tricky policy situation because we have this polarization and fragmentation at the national level.
Absolutely, and that issue of internal EU reform we'll come back to a little bit later on, but staying with migration for the moment. And Helena, the negotiations on the new pact, we've now seen there was an agreement between member states last week. It now goes to the European Parliament. What is the current state of play, and how do you see those negotiations playing out?
Yeah, so now that member states have their common position on the crisis regulation, this last piece of a set of packages under the new pact, it essentially means that the European Parliament is willing to both engage in trilogues on the crisis regulation, but also suspend the block that it had previously put on two of the files, the screening regulation and Eurodac, because it wasn't satisfied with the slow pace of member states' internal negotiations. And so essentially this means that sort of the gates are now open again, trilogues will continue, and at the same time, so on the one hand, there's renewed momentum, but at the same time, we know that in particular, in relation to the crisis regulation, there's a number of sticking points that don't look easy to resolve in the next coming months. And we also know that there's a deadline of even before June 2024, because if member states want to conclude the package, it will have to be sooner so that the text can be translated, et cetera, et cetera.
And
so
realistically, what chances of that?
Well, I think politically speaking, there's several ways of thinking about this. I think in Brussels, there's a lot of optimism. The Belgian presidency has also expressed keenness in sort of putting the final stitches on this and really making sure that all negotiations can conclude. And so I think that's kind of the general tenor that we hear in a lot of the discussions in Brussels. At the same time, we also have to consider the alternative, which is what if the new pact fails? And that essentially means, member states will have to sort of take a step back and look at all the deficits and the challenges that exist in the current system and try and figure out a way to improve those. This is not necessarily a new process, but it's kind of picking up where we were at a couple of years ago. And at the same time, some reforms have been made, but mainly on the operational side. And that is actually a benefit because it could suggest that those member states that feel overwhelmed and that need support could benefit from it. Again, it's just a small point, and it won't remarkably change the entire working, but it is perhaps something to highlight that it's not so black and white.
Just one other element I wanted to touch on with you, Helena, before I come back to Janis and to Fabian, the question of partnerships. There is a reference in the declaration that Charles Michel issued, because it couldn't be issued as a common declaration, about a comprehensive approach to migration that includes mutually beneficial comprehensive partnerships. There has, however, been a row over the deal that was struck by the Commission with Tunisia. Two questions here. What is the state of play in the efforts to conclude more of these sorts of deals? And what lessons do you draw from the arguments that are surrounding the EU-Tunisia deal?
Yeah, so for the first one, the European Commission has been regularly engaging with non-EU countries, particularly in its neighborhood, to try and conclude these partnerships. Egypt has been mentioned on several occasions. So this is still something that is very much underway. Vice President Skinas has also conducted several trips to that extent, and has tried to engage with the heads of state of these respective countries and see if they can actually take further steps to conclude these kind of migration partnerships. And this is something that we will likely see continuing. However, I think the difference here, the caveat, is that so long as the EU is not able to undertake and achieve a reform of the rules that exist internally when it comes to responsibility sharing, solidarity, the distribution of asylum seekers, et cetera, it will likely continue and increasingly also rely on these kinds of partnerships, thereby entailing a kind of outsourcing of responsibility. However, if we say even if there is reform, I think there's a broader question, which we see specifically with Tunisia now, which is what to do if partners are unreliable. We cannot really compare EU-Tunisia to the EU-Turkey statement or Libya. I mean, each case is different, but what we've seen so far is that this memorandum of understanding has a very weak potential to be implemented correctly, precisely because it is subject to the whims of an authoritarian leader. And so there's also a broader question, which I think goes beyond legislative cycles, et cetera, which is, as the EU tries to sort of understand and negotiate its strategic autonomy, it has to think very carefully about the kind of dependencies that it is perhaps developing through the kind of migration diplomacy, which inevitably also impacts what it tries to do in other policy areas. And so I think there's kind of a balance where I would argue that the EU is very aware of the costs that it entails, and it is willing to take them, but I still feel like this question hasn't really been fully answered. And it also raises the question again, when we think of countries like Egypt, is this really something that the EU wants to do? And is it willing to bear the costs?
Absolutely. Just, Fabian, a comment to this, and in particular, talking about the EU-Tunisia deal, we discussed at the last summit the parlous state of relations between Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel. There's been a public war of words over this, so much so that Manfred Weber, the EPP leader in the European Parliament, called on them to, quote, sit down together and sort this out internally. You please do comment more broadly on this issue, but also to that row and that ongoing sign of total dysfunction in the relationship. Does that matter, well, never mind for the EU row, but in terms of talking to these potential partners, talking about these deals, that we see this tension in the EU's leadership?
Well, I think I fully agree with Helena's analysis on the deals themselves. I think the overwhelming message which comes away from this is that we can't deal with external issues until we have sorted out the internal differences. And that keeps coming back in a variety of different policy areas. And it clearly is also a difficulty when we are negotiating with partners, because in a negotiation, it is important that you know what each side wants. And if one side is completely divided in itself, then that makes any negotiation extremely difficult, which is also why we've seen the big role of, for example, individual politicians in particular deals, because that is much easier to deal with for external partners. On the continuing difficulties in the relationship between von der Leyen and Michel, I think it is a major issue. It is something which has a fundamental impact. on the way the EU acts internally and the way the EU can act externally. Internally, the cooperation between these two is incredibly important when it comes to setting strategic long-term priorities. And especially at this moment in time, they should be working together to agree on what to put on the agenda rather than working against each other, which seems to be where we are at the moment. And for external partners, this is even a strengthening of the feeling that they don't know who to talk to when they're talking to the European Union. If you have these very obvious differences between some of the leading figures.
Thank you, Janis. A quick comment to this. Then I want to ask Helena to take us forward to the next European Council, the formal council, and then we'll move on from migration. But Janis.
I think I agree with Fabian. It is a major issue. However, having said that, it's not being treated as being a major issue. If you follow the debates now on the future EU leadership, if you discuss with national players, what they have in mind is more of who gets what in terms of the geography, and related to the puzzle of EU leadership, in terms of the political colors, in terms of big and small member states. So there are various considerations which people have in mind, but the relationship between the President of the European Council and the President of the European Commission is not at the forefront of the thinking. It's more the old traditional bazaar mentality. Now, having said that, it will also very much depend on who the personalities will be, and the puzzle will probably unfold when we have more clarity with respect to what Ursula von der Leyen wants. So if she stays for another 5 years, and if she actually gets the support to stay for another 5 years, she will be in a different position than she was 5 years ago, when she started together with Michel. So you will have a certain experience. There might be also someone chosen from the European Council who she has been working with. Let's not forget, she is also a member of the European Council. So it really depends on a number of factors, but I think that one should not, and as it is being done now, underestimate the significance of how these two positions are interlinked with each other.
Absolutely. Helena, before I let you go, the next council, you said what happened at these meetings obviously feeds into the formal EU summit at the end of October. Concretely, what would you expect EU leaders to be discussing there?
Well, I mean, any of the issues that are mentioned in the declaration that Charles Michel published are really on the top of the agenda. So again, but my point really was, or my reflection really was more the fact that they were not able to agree on a joint declaration at the informal summit doesn't really instill a lot of hope that the discussions at the formal UCO in 2 weeks' time are going to be any more positive. That said, there is another JHA Council in the meantime. Of course, this follows on the heels of several other meetings. So there's only so and so much progress that can be made in such a short amount of time. But at this point in time, it looks to be either a very politicized debate around it, and then also further opposition by heads of state that either outright oppose the way that things have been going in the negotiations, but also those that maybe don't perhaps even sufficiently appreciate the art of making compromises. Because what we've seen is that the interior ministers are having to negotiate compromises, feel quite satisfied, and as soon as they return to capitals, they're having to defend them. And that's not to say that one is right or the other, but it's just becoming increasingly difficult, I think, to kind of communicate and convey the meaning of what was being discussed on either side. And so I think
I'm sure we're going to come back to in future updates, and Janis touched on it earlier. What does all this mean when it comes to the European election campaign next year? But Helena, for now, always wonderful to have you on Update. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully see you back here again soon. Thank you so much. Just with Janis and Fabian, I want to touch, before we focus on the declaration that came out from EU leaders, on a couple of other things related to the European Political Community meeting. And the first one being Ukraine. Zelensky got plenty of assurances that how EU countries would continue to support him. But did he get any more concrete promises of help? And also the French president, Emmanuel Macron, warned, quote, "We don't have the right to be tired." The fact that he felt the need to issue the warning, Janis, suggests that he fears EU leaders are suffering from war fatigue, and there is a risk that we will not see the same levels of support for Ukraine. What was your reading of the outcome of the discussions on that?
Well, I think in general you can see that there is war fatigue. So you don't have to only look into the to EPOC meeting of last week. You can see it in the public debates, where the issue of the war in Ukraine is no longer often in the headlines of the discussions. There are other issues which people feel are more significant to them. So there is this fatigue, which is a general phenomenon. Let's not also forget that there is a certain fatigue also in the US. If you follow the discussions there, also them heavily into election mode or pre-election mode. So there is a fear also on the European side of what potentially it might mean if the US would not maybe fully retreat, but to some degree retreat. We already saw that the spending has been cut. So who's going to come into the equation? It needs to probably be, or it has to be, the Europeans. The bigger fear is what happens if the US also retreats when it comes to military support. In all its different facets. So it's in terms of arms support, but also in terms of information support. The US obviously providing a lot of intelligence to Kiev. So I think there is a fear of what potentially could happen, and that if there is a substantial not only fatigue, but retreat also on the European side, that would mean disaster. So it's increasing the pressure on us Europeans to live up to the equation. If you would ask Zelensky whether the Europeans are doing that, his response would probably be, actually not. He would not be satisfied what we are doing, and there is an argument in case of that. But there still is a lot which needs to be discussed at the European level, and we will come back to that when we discuss the strategic agenda and the priorities.
I want to talk about enlargement and the implications there. But Fabian, overall, I mean, Janis said earlier, described the EPOC as a forum for high-level political exchange. But Helena said, one big question, what is the added value of the European political community? Now, there had been speculation ahead of time, had been hopes that there would be progress towards resolving a humanitarian crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh, that it could help to diffuse tensions between Kosovo and Serbia. These things fell flat, didn't happen. But and that led some people, then when you saw the cancellation of the press conference because of the row between Spain and Sunak over migration, led some to say that the European political community is already falling apart, that it's in a deep coma. Do you agree with that? What did you read into? Are the expectations too high if we say it's a forum for diffusing tensions? Is it becoming any clearer to you what this community is really for, and whether it can succeed? Same question to both of you, starting with Fabian.
Sure. I think firstly, I don't think expectations were particularly high. I think, yes, some people were mentioning some hopes attached to it. But the reality, I think, is that essentially it is a talking shop. Now, that in itself is not a bad thing. We have had a need to have a forum also where leaders can come together and talk face to face. That's something which didn't happen during COVID. And given the transnational nature of the challenges which we are facing, I think there's a good argument that something like that should exist. But the idea that it would be a forum which would significantly advance policy in a number of areas, I think was always an overestimation of what the EPOC could actually do.
But you think it has value anyway as a talking shop?
Well, I think yes, because even if you have conflict, it is good to air those conflicts and to actually see where the differences lie. But that doesn't mean that EPOC can in any way resolve those conflicts. And I think this is the bit where people's expectations were simply too high. You have to recognize that in the end, you have to have real mechanisms, real resources, real political leverage to get these kind of questions resolved. And that is not going to be done at the EPOC level.
Thank you. A thought on that, Janis, before we move to the informal summit and the Granada declaration?
Well, I think it is clear that EPOC has a raison d'être crisis. We do not know what is there for. The expectations were much higher before the first meeting of EPOC, when people were thinking it might serve purpose A or B or C, and there were a lot of conceptual discussions as to what functions EPOC could fulfill. But since it has become more or less a talking shop, the expectations are low, as Fabian was saying. And as there's no inclination to think of a higher degree of institutionalization of EPOC, or linking it to money, which is always something which can revive things. As long as that there is not that discussion, it will remain as what it is. And one could say, you know, it doesn't do any harm, and there's a need for exchange, so let's continue doing it. But then the expectation need to remain as low as they are. And here I want to insert the fact that if you look into the Franco-German expert group paper, they're talking about 4 layers in a differentiated Europe, and one layer explicitly mentioned is EPOC, is the European Political Community. And I wouldn't suggest that that is by coincidence, because there was also a mandate given to the group, and also knowing some of the internal discussions, there are also hopes which are associated in Paris and Berlin to EPOC, but are they then actually ready to invest into it? Or will it remain where it is? So there's still more questions than answers with respect to its future.
So let us come on to the so-called Granada Declaration. As you said at the start, Janis, this was at the beginning of a discussion on the EU's strategic priorities to set, and I quote, a strategic course of action to shape our common future for the benefit of all. We've talked about something that wasn't in the declaration, namely migration, because of the arguments with Hungary and Poland. What was in it, Janis? I mean, it reads to me a bit like a shopping list of everything you could possibly mention. Is it, I mean, does it begin to indicate what the priorities will be? Or at the moment, is it merely that shopping list?
It is a shopping list, but it is important at the beginning, outset of such a discussion, that you agree at least on what the overall framework is about. And obviously, you also need to read between the lines when you read the declaration, but also when you listen to what Charles Michel said after the informal summit, which, by the way, went somewhat further than the declaration itself. So it is the beginning of a process. But you see that there are issues which are high on the agenda: security and defense, which is something which was clearly mentioned, also, by the way, high on the agenda of Michel, resilience and competition, the single market, engagement with international partners, and enlargement. And Michel, by the way, very explicitly in his remarks after the end of the Granada summit, also spoke about money, the budget, which also is obviously part of that equation. But as we were saying earlier, and I should have also mentioned migration, which is not mentioned because of all the politics surrounding it. But I think what is important is that you have this discussion, that it becomes more concrete. And I wonder as to whether we will see a lot of progress in the upcoming weeks and months, as was indicated that there will be, given the major differences between member states. So we'll see also what the level of ambition will be of the Belgian presidency. It seems that they're thinking of something which will be grand and maybe something similar to the Laeken Declaration, for those who remember. But we see how difficult it is to find agreement among the 27. The discussion we had earlier when it comes to Poland, I think, is key. If there is a change of government in Poland, that will give a momentum. And hopefully also Paris and Berlin will realize that they need to grab that momentum once it comes. But now this is merely a start. It's nice words. It gives a sense of orientation, but nothing more.
Fabian, nice words, gives a sense of orientation. Is that your reading of where we are?
I'm probably even more negative, because I think what we're seeing here is that even at the level of very high level priorities, we're seeing differences between the member states. And this is the level which should be easiest to agree, because ultimately we all know what is on the agenda. We all know in what areas we have to make progress. But the difficulty is that there's actually not any agreement on what we want to achieve in these different areas, how we're going to achieve it, who is going to do that, what kind of competences, what kind of money, etc., is going to be used, how is this actually going to be delivered. So that's already starting to bleed into the discussions around the strategic agenda. And that doesn't bode well for the ability of the European Union to actually address the underlying issues, which in the end of the day will require very difficult choices. It will require prioritization. It will require dealing with extremely tricky trade-offs and distributional issues, which nobody wants to face at the moment. So if we are already struggling at this stage of the process, where it is only about some nice blah blah to put on paper, then I think it doesn't bode well for the future.
Janis, you wanted to jump back in?
Yes, I want to, because Fabian said he would be negative, so let me add another element to the negativity. If you look back 5 years ago, you had a president of the European Council at the time, Donald Tusk, and if you look back 10 years ago, Herman van Rompuy, who had a certain position within the European Council, and they were able to push in order to have that kind of a discussion on the strategic agenda. Let's not forget, it's a rather new tool which the European Council is using, but they were pushing. They were having a leadership function. Now you have a president of the European Council, Charles Michel, who is not in that strong position. So even if you listen to him carefully after the Granada Declaration, where he mentioned 4 priorities, and that they were more concrete, actually. He said we need to strengthen our economic base, security and defense, energy, and engage with the rest of the world. These were the 4 things he mentioned. So he boiled it down to something which is more concrete than the general words in the document. Okay. So he might be trying to push in a certain direction, but I'm questioning myself as to whether he has the political authority to do so, because he does not enjoy that much of support in the European Council. So you have a vacuum. And I could extend that, because look into the situation in Paris with a weak president, look into the German coalition government. We were referring to that earlier when we were talking about the elections in Bavaria and Hessen. So who's going to fill that gap to push the discussion in the direction it needs to go? So I think compared to 5 years or 10 years ago, we're even now in a more difficult situation when you look into that picture, while the challenges we have and the links between the different elements that need to be thought together are much bigger than they had been 5 or 10 years ago.
Let's touch on a few of those elements that you mentioned, starting with the strengthening of the economic base, because Fabian, if I could ask you, did the discussion and the declaration really take the debate on so-called strategic autonomy and the EU's resilience and long-term competitiveness, that big theme of the Ursula von der Leyen State of the Union address a couple of weeks ago? Did it move us forward? And at the same time, there was this emphasis, which we haven't seen so much of recently, on multilateralism, on global partnerships. Is that because people see a tension, a need to balance the debate on strategic autonomy with openness? What's going on there?
Yes, I think what we've seen there is that there are certain elements coming onto the European agenda in a rather strong way. Competitiveness, how do we actually ensure that this works for Europeans' businesses? This is something where we have a lot of discussion. But I think what we are actually seeing in terms, even within that confine of this short statement, is actually contradictions, because we are talking about, on the one hand, a rather protective agenda, talking about how do we address the vulnerabilities. On the other hand, we are talking about multilateralism, the global open society, and these do not easily go together anymore. I mean, clearly, it would be ideal for Europe if we had a globally open system where we would be allowed in certain areas to opt out of it if we think it is too dangerous in terms of our vulnerabilities. But we have to finally stop to talk about the world as we want it to be rather than as it is. The reality is that the global multilateral system is very sick, and that's probably putting it mildly. We are talking about a world where we have 2 rival superpowers, which no longer believe in any multilateral system. So Europe is very lonely, and it is not doing very much to resolve that. We're talking about a world where there's intense pressure on businesses, also to retain competitiveness, while at the same time having these transformations. So it's an incredibly difficult environment. And just talking about what we would like to have is not going to cut it. And I think this also, and I know this wasn't the topic in Granada, but I think this is also, when we look at the State of the Union, our solution to increasing the competitiveness of Europe's firm is we ask for another report. Is that really going to be the action we need?
Referring
What is
to the
missing
Mario
is
Draghi report that
yeah,
has been commissioned. Yeah.
and what is missing in all of these areas is actually a real engagement with the hard choices, which we are going to have to make.
Janis, feel free to react on that, but I also wanted to pick up on another point. With the declaration, one of the key features of it is in relation to enlargement. You mentioned it earlier. It describes enlargement as, and I quote, a geostrategic investment in peace, security, stability, and prosperity, but also stresses the need for would-be members to step up their reforms and for the EU, and again, I'm quoting, to lay the necessary groundwork and reforms. What should we read into this? Does it take the discussion any further forward? Does it signal the sort of decisions we can expect in the coming months on these key questions? What's your reading of what happened and the statement on that?
Well, this was not a surprising statement. We know that finally we've come to the conclusion that it is, in our words, a geostrategic imperative, in the words of the declaration, a geostrategic investment. And there's a difference between what both things indicate. But at least, compared to 1.5 years ago, where I think that some of us immediately after the invasion of Ukraine were clear in their heads that it is a geopolitical imperative. And now at least we're having more of a debate. It's become more concrete. There is more pressure. It is now high on the agenda. A year ago, this was not yet the case. So at least we're moving. Having said that, and that was the positive part, having said that, the question is whether we're actually preparing ourselves. I think the candidates, those who actually want to join the European Union, are trying. They're also enhancing their efforts because they see that there now is a potential that they might have a chance to join the European Union. But on the side of the EU, I think that we have huge differences among different players within the council, between institutions, if you follow discussions about what needs to be done with respect to providing the internal groundwork and reforms, to quote what the declaration says, there are huge differences of opinion. There are still some who believe, they don't say it openly, that actually maybe it won't be necessary to enlarge, especially if Ukraine has problem. And let's not forget, they were the actual accelerator of developments. There's some who think that if they have problems with rule of law, if they have problems related to corruption, that will disqualify them from actually being able to join, and then enlargement might be put on the back burner. But then there are others like Michel and also others who say they even want to put a date, and they're talking about 2030. That would increase pressure. But in actual terms of us moving on the EU side, I don't see that is happening. And if it doesn't happen before the EP elections, I don't think that things will become easier because.
Yeah, we're still, Fabian, in that general language about laying the necessary groundworks and reforms when it comes to the EU's, what the EU itself needs to do. Makes me wonder, when are we going to move beyond this sort of general language to more concrete decisions? You talked about the key issues, the trade-offs, the tensions that need to be addressed. How did you read these words?
I wouldn't say when are we coming to that point. I would say whether we will come to that point, because I think it's far from clear that there is a political will to tackle some of these issues, not least because some of them are incredibly tricky politically. They are domestically very contentious. We are talking about, for example, issues like decision-making mechanisms, which, as we've seen also over the last days, bear a lot of potential in terms of conflict between member states. We are talking about potentially having to go ahead in some areas without everyone on board. And I think this would be my major question. And Janis already highlighted, they use a different language. They don't say an imperative, because the question is, what happens if we fail to do this? What happens if the EU is not ready to accept new member state? What happens if those member states, those aspirants have not made enough process which gets us to the point where they can become members easily? It doesn't remove the imperative. It just simply means we have to deal with this situation differently. And what we cannot do, and I think this is the really important message, we cannot in the end be unrealistic about a process which as its endpoint has to have membership, certainly for Ukraine and also for other countries. But at the moment, that's not how we're treating this. We're treating this as if we have a lot of time and if we can wait and see and weigh up between different factors.
Indeed. Yeah, just a very quick one, because I want to come on to security and defense, and then there's a question from our audience, and then I want to wrap things up.
If we are actually not moving, and we're indicating that we're not becoming concrete in terms of how we will reform ourselves, that also undermines the trust on the sides of those who want to become member of the European Union. And that undermines their readiness to do the reforms and the tough reforms that they still need to do. So these both things are linked with each other. And I fear that we're sending the wrong signals, and that will have a geopolitical cost, as Fabian was indicating. And the second point, I see unholy alliances. If you look into those people who say we need to reform the EU from member states' perspective, you see that we'll talk a lot about the composition of the Commission, the composition of the EP, the question of qualified majority voting in the Council, and a lot of the other things that potentially need to be done are not being discussed. And it's interesting to see the Polish reaction to the Franco-German paper, which often, if you read at what the minister is saying, resembles some of the positions which others who I would not put in the same camp as the Polish do also have.
Okay.
So we're seeing potential unholy alliances.
Okay. 2 words, Janis, and I'm really going to ask for 2 words on this one, because you raised it as the first issue you mentioned, the words, the language on security and defense, talking about strengthening the EU's defense readiness and further developing its technological and industrial base. You have long called for the EU at updates and in other fora to move further and faster on this issue. Does this give you any greater hope that they will?
Actually, I must say no. And not only because of what is in the statement, but also what you see on the ground in the member states, or in terms of cooperation among member states. We're far behind raising the level not only of expectation, but the level of needs to the level which we require given the situation we're in. Now, the problem with defense is that when you get to the moment where you actually feel the pressure is even higher, where I wonder what we still require to get to that moment, and to actually deliver takes many, many years. This is not something where you can say, okay, now we got pressure, we're going to do A, B, and C, and we're going to have a result within 2, 3, or 4 years. Sometimes it takes 5, 10, 15 years to get to the point where your actual capability, and at the end of the day, it's about capabilities and capacities, are at the level which you need. So what we're hearing and what we're seeing on the ground is by no means what we need. And going back to something which was already mentioned earlier, I think it was by Fabian, when it comes to hard choices and trade-offs, I think you will see that it will be difficult to persuade our publics that we need to invest more into defense, and that means also money, hard choices, while if the US elections move in the wrong direction, knock wood, maybe then you will have the pressure that you need. And I wonder whether
and also the global, we started talking about the volatility of the global environment. That does make the case. Let me just take one very quick comment, more comment than a question, but Fabian, perhaps you could briefly react to it, from Just van Eersel, going back to the discussion about the AFD, saying it is a serious phenomenon, very serious. It is nationalistic. It undermines the tiny degree of leadership that the EU so badly needs, and, says Just, may foster equal effects in other countries. In my view, he says, this development does not only affect migration or purely political affairs, but also may affect existing economic policies in the EU as well. This, he says, could be damn serious because it could be a downward spiral. How do you see these connections, and can we reverse the trend? Fabian, it's going to have to be a quick one, please, minute or so.
Very quick. I fully agree. It goes far beyond migration. I think it goes far beyond the AfD, because I think this is about these parties gaining ground everywhere. And what my real worry is with this is what it leads to is inaction of everyone else, because it becomes more difficult to do things at home. So we're all catching the British disease, which is essentially saying, yes, I know what needs to be done, but I could never sell that at home. And in any case, the populists are hard at my heels.
Okay, we are almost out of time, but I did want to just come back and get a final reflection from each of you. Start with Fabian this time. The Granada Declaration, as I mentioned, was billed as a first step towards developing the EU strategic agenda to be adopted next year. Overall, what did it tell you? What did those discussions, the declaration, with all the concerns that you have, what did it tell you about the direction of travel? Even if it's not addressing some of those tough issues, is it moving in the right direction? We can entitle today's event "Moving Towards New Strategic Priorities" with a question mark. Do you see anything that indicates to you that we may be moving in the direction you think we need to go? Same question to both of you. Fabian first, Janis afterwards.
Well, in a rather meaningless way, yes, we can say we are moving towards setting strategic priorities, because at the end of this process, we will have a document which will say strategic priorities at the top. But the question is, does it address the underlying trade-offs? Does it address the issues which we have been talking about, not just in this update, but for many updates now? And I think the answer is no. I think all the indications are that despite the grand announcements of Zeitenwende, grand announcements of recognizing the severity of the situation, the challenges we face, that in the final analysis, leaders are not willing to make the hard choices, which will also cost them personally, will cost them in terms of political future. But they are the hard choices which are necessary. But for this moment in time, we are still much better at the rhetoric of Zeitenwende than actually translating that into our priorities.
Janis?
Fabian is right. Obviously, we'll get to a strategic agenda. There will be something on paper which will indicate what we need to do. But I think there are two things which worry me. One is the leadership question. The leadership question with respect to both the level of ambitions, but also with respect to the readiness to actually be ready to push for the implementation of what you have agreed. So even if you agree on something which is not concrete enough, there still is a chance that you will be moving. But if there is no leadership, and I'm talking about the EU and the national level, and then we actually have a severe problem. But at least there is now a discussion. We're going to have a pre-enlargement policy review coming from the Commission. We need a debate about the governance review, and we need a debate about budget, and all this needs to be thought together. But the question is, where does the momentum come from? Where does leadership come from? And actually, this argument of we will do whatever is necessary once we get to the point where it is necessary, I think is flawed. So I think that if we do not have developments from now until June of next year, i.e. until the strategic agenda will be set, until the European Parliament elections will take place, afterwards things will not get easier. So my advice will be as concrete as you can be at this present point in time, in terms of your ambitions, in terms of what needs to be done, but also in terms of the process which you're setting in place to get further. Am I very optimistic about all that? I must say, unfortunately not, but that's maybe also because I'm sick.
And thank you very much for being with us, despite not feeling so great. That is all we have time for. Just a couple of events to flag up. linking to the discussions we've been having today. EPC events on Wednesday, one on reconciling competitiveness and economic security. And next Monday, those crucial Polish elections, what is at stake for the EU. Also a couple of events this week on EU-Turkey relations, tomorrow on the customs agreement, and on Wednesday on foreign policy. So do look out for those, and we will be back with another update after the formal EU summit later this month. Until then, thank you, Janis, thank you, Fabian, thank you, Helena, now in absence. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and look forward to seeing those of you who can join us next time after the EU summit. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you, goodbye.